Oh, Greg.
Greg? Lee, let's start with you.
Would you define forgiveness on a larger scale to be based on memory?
I'm sorry, you must be.
Sorry, I'm a mumbler. Would you define forgiveness on a larger scale as something that would address a historic memory? It's like a remembering without hate.
I think that forgiveness can certainly address historic memory. I think we have a fascinating example of that in the fact that there still are Holocaust survivors, for example, who find it impossible to forgive either the Nazis in particular or the Germans. And we're certainly faced with a historic memory issue there. Perhaps the best answer I can offer you from my standpoint to what you're raising is that forgiveness addresses any situation where there's been the perpetration of either humiliation or other sense of psychological pain or physical pain, pain or offense, in whatever time frame. And when we come to historical guilts, even across generations, to the extent that we belong to different identity groups and take those group identities seriously as part of our essence, it's quite conceivable that, for example, we might be facing, and I believe we are facing, an issue of historic guilts, historic pains, potential historic forgiveness in the whole relationship between those of Spanish descent and those of indigenous descent here in Andean America. So yes, I've answered in 400 words, or I might have been able to answer in one.
I'm asking that because it makes me think of the Jean-Paul Lederach quote, we have to look backwards in order to go forwards. Maybe this is a slippery slope logical fallacy, but in the example that you gave us of trying to rebalance the situation.
Not the situation, the inner state of the victim. I don't know if that changes what you're saying. It's not the situation that gets rebalanced. The establishment of balance that Worthington is talking about, that I was trying to convey, if I don't convey it properly, forgive me, is an internal reality. It's a psychological reality. That doctor on the steps of the courthouse in New Haven, Connecticut, was talking about his satisfaction. It was the result of an objective reality outside of himself, but it could not have been the result. He could still have felt the same hatred, the same venom, the same willingness to be the one who, either plugged in the electric chair or, but no, in his emotional reality, a balance was struck by the external reality, but that balance that was struck inside of him could not have been struck. I don't know if I'm clear.
Because I'm just curious, maybe this is a much more abstract question based off of that, but is that gentleman really balanced at that point?
I clearly cannot answer that question. Even if I were to psychoanalyze him, I'm not sure I'd be able to answer that question, because we're talking about such an intimate reality. He could be telling himself that he is because he thinks he ought to be, or he gets he ought, no. So let's not discuss whether or not, as a matter of fact, he is or he is not. Let's rather take it to a more abstract level and ask ourselves, is that possible? Is that feasible? And there I think it's easier to remit ourselves to our own experiences. And perhaps to the simplest of our own experiences, which is those moments when we've taken revenge. And have we felt better as a result? Is that why we describe revenge as sweet? And I think the answer is yes.
And I would say yes in the short term, but in the long term, this is from my own personal experience. I feel worse.
Would you be willing to posit that everyone feels worse? Would you generalize that? Or are we opened up a next fork in the road that says some could feel worse, some could continue to feel well?
I don't mean to push my own experiences on everybody else. But
okay, what's your hypothesis? You think most people end up feeling worse? People feel guilty because they've taken revenge?
I think
Should we take a quick vote on that? I think that it's interesting. How many of us would posit as our hypothesis, as the hypothesis to be tested in some experimental manner, that once we take revenge, what I'm hearing the two of you saying, please tell me if I'm misstating your position, we will inevitably roll back to feeling guilty about having taken revenge. How many of the two of you have declared that you believe that to be the case? That's your hypothesis. How many of us would hypothesize the opposite, that the majority of us would rather feel, yeah, we can now leave it behind us. We took
But I
revenge.
think it can't. It's not like that. It's not like that. It's not as clear. I feel like maybe one will like feel more guilt, and someone will maybe at one point feel guilt, and then not, or maybe someone will feel guilt later. So I don't feel like it's
feel
yes or no.
guilt. Okay, fair enough. Eliminate the yeah, quick, yeah, that's not relevant. Over time, through whatever complexities, but I understand your hypothesis to be that most human beings will end up feeling guilty. This sounds very much like Stanley Milgram's original hypothesis, that most human beings have a sense of moral break, and they will not continue to pass current to their poorly learning students. And Stanley Milgram's hypothesis proved to be completely wrong.
In a question about that real quick, in Milgram's experiments, wasn't there the appearance of someone with a sense of power and authority?
Of course, what Milgram proved is that we humans are extremely prone to submitting to authority. But he set out to prove something else. I was a student of Stanley Milgram's, and his original hypothesis was that we humans have a moral break within us that will preclude our continuing to pull the switches as wrong answers keep coming up. Are we all familiar with Stanley Milgram's experiments, or shall I briefly describe them? No. Stanley Milgram was a psychologist at Yale who posited that human beings are essentially good. So if, under the direction of an authority figure that tends to force them to do so, they are asked to, the experiment consists of this. Let's say you're the subject and Greg is apparently the other part of the subject. I'm Dr. Milgram, and I say to you, look, Greg is supposed to have learned this long list of lessons, and you are going to test him. And I then take a live wire with 15 volts and I say, zap, and I touch you with me. And I say to you, every time Greg gives you a wrong answer, you're going to pass current to Greg. But not just 15 volts. The second time it'll be 30, the third time it'll be 45, all the way up to 450 volts, with which you turn someone's brain into charcoal, if you really pass them through. Okay? Now, go for it. And the hypothesis was that at some point when Greg started screaming, no, stop, it hurts, you would stop. Now the fact is that a fair number of the subjects started saying, but Professor Milgram, and Professor Milgram, the authority figure, would say, keep going. And 73.6% of his original group of subjects kept right on going to 450 volts, with Greg screaming, pleading for mercy. The authority figure said keep going, they kept going. So Milgram proved something radically different from what he set out to prove. And what I'm hearing from the two of you is closer to his original hypothesis, that we're all basically morally sound, morally good. But let me finish the quick survey here. Anyone else agree with Ian and Jessica that we would, most of us, essentially feel guilty if we end up taking revenge? You two, you agree?
I think it's a
How many of us
I'm a
disagree?
constructivist. I'm uncomfortable with this deterministic most and will definitely, but I think it could happen.
It's
that
a
people-
nurture.
Oh, could, no doubt about it. But the key, the statement from Ian came that no, actually Ian was careful not to project to the universe. I'm asking to see if we're willing to project to the universe. It could happen. Of course, it could happen. Almost anything could happen. So yeah, I agree with the non-determinism here. Please.
Well, I have a question. Like, is guilt like the final feeling, or like can you feel guilty for a period of time, but then rationalize like why you took revenge, and then rationalize that feeling so that you no longer feel guilty?
I will plead Jeff Pugh. It could be a temporary feeling, or it could be a permanent condition. My sense, having studied vengefulness and highly escalated, or lived in highly escalated conflict for decades now, is that a great many people feel extremely satisfied with having taken revenge, and they say, as we say here in Ecuador, toma, and are done with it. And are perfectly pleased to have restored that balance based on their own restoration of a sense of their own power, of their own ability to inflict pain as well as receive it. Now, is that how we human beings are wired? No, I think that has to do essentially with the insecurity of the majority of human beings. I think that mature human beings would tend rather, and mature would require a definition, but as I define a mature human being, which has to do with psychological independence, a great deal of openness to other, very much in a Carol Gilligan approach to human maturity, I think not. I think that we're willing to not be sensitive. Rather I would go along with your sense that one would feel bad about having done that. But a great many human beings still do feel very, very comfortable in taking revenge. Yes, Blanca?
Yeah, I would like to ask you something. Do you think it's something like this type of revenge feeling? It's something cultural, or from your family probably, or like from the way how you were raised?
You're back to the theories of aggression, aren't you?
Yeah, but because I'm saying this because I'm thinking about all these Correa's this discourse about prohibido olvidar, and like him as an authority, reminding us or reminding people that already forgive all this situation, the
long neoliberal night.
yeah, and all that. You know, like for many of us, it was good. I mean, like it was a disgrace, of course, the dollarization, the war, everything. It was bad, I know. But it worked out good for many of us as well. Like going out to another country and come back with another type of vision. And like, I don't see, I mean, I know it was bad, but at the same time, now that I see it, it probably happens for some reason. And the way I was raised always is like, or like my parents always tell us, like, if you carry hate, that's what you're gonna give to the world. So you need to leave that back and just kind of like keep going.
Okay, let me offer my view of the original question. Do I think this is cultural? Do I think this is essentially psychological? Is it social psychology? I think it answers to causes in all of the above. A fair part of it has to do with personological development, with the extent to which a person has transcended the essential narcissism of psychological underdevelopment and is able to view things truly, openly, from the perspective of other. Are you familiar with Carol Gilligan's work?
No.
Okay, I commend her to your attention. Carol Gilligan is perhaps the single most impressive author in a line of thinking that goes back to the 1980s that submits that an essential part of psychological maturity is also moral maturity, and has to do with openness to other, with the very opposite of the fight or flight neurobiological response. That very opposite is care and befriend. And there is a long line of thinkers now that are submitting, and I certainly subscribe to this view, that we are actually pretty much geared to both possibilities. And it is how the more positive, the more constructive, the more cooperative of these possibilities is nurtured in us. And nurtured not only by others, but by our environment, but by ourselves, the degree to which we become active participants in our own continued psychological and emotional development. So there's one component. The other component certainly has to do with dominant paradigms in the society. One very clear dominant paradigm in our society, under which I grew up, is you're going to go to hell if you're bad. I can remember being told as a 4-year-old by my own mother, you're going straight to hell. Just as an anecdotal variation on that, I remember being taken to I don't remember, I've been told that I was taken to one of the colonial churches as a small child, and I was holding the hand of my nana, and I saw a blood-soaked Christ, and my comment was, boy, he must have misbehaved. That kind of thing places, as the old Puritan expression would have it, the fear of God in you, and clearly has an influence. part of why I earlier submitted that it's extremely important. I don't know if you were here yet. I earlier submitted that it's extremely important to challenge these paradigms under which we've been brought up. In part, we're back to the classic debate on the nature and origins of aggression. Is it a natural impulse, a la Freud, Konrad Lorenz, etc., etc.? Is it a response to frustration, a la Dollar-Doom, Miller, Maurer, and Sears, the frustration aggression theory? Is it learned, a la Albert Bandura? We all these various theories. And because we can't prove any of them to be true beyond a reasonable doubt, it becomes important just to decide what we believe, to make a choice among these various options. I don't think I've answered your question. I've offered you my view on the topic you've raised. Jeff, please.
I'd like to sort of interrogate a little bit the language of reconciliation, because you've built this argument of forgiveness not being a necessary condition for restoring this balance.
And maybe we'll get into justice.
Yeah, so it's going to be related. Hopefully this can be a bridge or something. But one question is, I mean, you're a psychologist, so the balance you explicitly said just now to Ian was internal. It's a internal balance. But a lot of times when people use the word reconciliation, they frame it as an interpersonal or intergroup phenomenon. So it seems like there's a bridge there that has to be unpacked. If I personally,
they're not mutually exclusive.
Let me finish though. There's a writing of the internal balance. I can imagine all kinds of scenarios where between two groups, there is a decision to not use forgiveness to address it. But is that reconciliation? A lot of people would use something like transitional justice, stuff like that. So two examples that I've studied a little bit are Mozambique and Rwanda. And these are both cases that had catastrophic destructive conflict, something afterwards that people were coexisting, weren't engaged in violent conflict. But in the case of Rwanda, neither of them was really forgiveness to some extent.
And neither of them was really reconciliation either.
That's where I want to get to. So in Rwanda, the collective decision was, we want accountability. So there was, vengeance was written into the transitional justice plan and courts and trials and stuff. In Rwanda, I started out thinking that was the paradigmatic case of forgiveness because there was none of that. But when I talked to Andrea Bartoli from the Community de San Egidio, who helped mediate that case, he said it wasn't actually forgiveness, it was more a decision to forget and not actually address this
We're
conflict.
behind, very much. We're back to Worthington, aren't we?
Yeah.
Forgiveness is not a necessary condition.
So what I'm curious of, is that reconciliation? It is transitional justice. It's moving from one, Ricardo Lagos put this to me, that it's moving from a before to an after, but I'm not sure if that's the same thing as reconciliation. Maybe
I would agree that it's not necessarily the same thing, but I think we need to think of this in successive terms, and not in terms of equating any of these elements with each other, but recognizing that I think the first comment I would offer you, Jeff, is that inner balance, viewed from a psychological standpoint, is not the act itself of reconciliation, but certainly a precondition to
necessary but not sufficient.
A necessary but not sufficient precondition. And what we're saying is that it is the establishment of balance by whichever of these several means, not only through forgiveness, that is the precondition. That's where Donna Hicks and I, amongst others, differ from Tutu. What we're saying is, yes, there is a necessary precondition, it's the establishment of that balance, but the only road there to is not forgiveness. And we therefore, I think, liberate ourselves from that terrible moral issue of leaning on the victims to forgive, which is frequently just outrageously unfair. Okay, we clear that far? Now, that said, if you have two groups formerly massacring one another in 800,000 in a few days, in a few weeks in 1994, for example, and they now come back down to cold escalated conflict, which we were just talking about this with my son during the break. The Malvinas, Argentina-UK case is a similar case. It went hot only once in over 200 years, in close to 300 years, during the war that was very short-lived. But it's still cold and angry, And you talk to Argentinians about Brits and Brits about Argentinians, but more talk to Argentinians about Brits. And there's this incredibly demonized image, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the essential hallmarks of escalation, except for violence in confrontation, are present. Now that can also happen after the signing of a peace accord. We could theoretically have signed the accord between Peru and Ecuador in 1998 and still hate one another. There's a lot of that in Northern Ireland, which is why I tried to convey this interesting difference between, Good Friday was April 98, we signed in October 98. The two processes are almost coterminous. And yet what has evolved between Ecuador and Peru and what has evolved between the Northern Irish Catholics and Protestants is fundamentally different. There is still an unbelievable amount of resentment and anger and bottled up poison in the Northern Irish situation, which is rapidly evanescing, if not significantly evanesced, in the Ecuador Peru. So now, which of these do we call reconciliation? That's a tough one because now we could have, it seems to me, and right now I'm responding without ever having thought about this, so I appreciate your giving me new food for thought. I have nothing to do, so thank you.
Got you back.
It seems to me that we might be able to begin a theory of multiple different kinds of reconciliations. Different characteristics to reconciliation, all of which can reasonably be described as the establishment of a new constructive relationship between the parties. Now, that could even include some level of, how much milk is there in the coffee or how much coffee is in the milk, i.e., to what extent are the vengeful, angry remnants still there, still being ruminated over, et cetera, and to the extent that they are, we're speaking of a less complete, a less successful, I think that's where your very interesting remarks lead me to. And we open up a whole beautiful new field of exploration, which is, should we not parse the concept of reconciliation into variants thereon, and perhaps start thinking of even other terms. Cecilia.
How do you connect reconciliation to the basic need of justice?
Okay,
Like,
that was my next stage, but
no, I was just wondering because actually retaliation, restoring the balance, is a way to satisfy our need of justice, and even like truth telling. Maybe we just want to have our dignity restored, and that's enough.
I'm sorry, your name is Mariela. As Mariela was saying, part of it could well be just having the recognition on the part of the perpetrator.
Exactly, recognition is dignity.
But one of the really sticky things about reconciliation processes is precisely the whole justice issue. And we are certainly, at least those of us who are heirs of the long Western tradition, are very much heirs to a retaliatory sense of justice. Justice means punishing. It's not fair they get away with it, etc., etc. This is Uribe's chant in Colombia. Esos bandidos no pueden salirse con las suyas. And this becomes a really, really sticky wicket, as the Brits would put it, because if you're really, really serious about punishing every member of the FARC for all of the atrocities committed by the FARC, you're going to continue to be in war for the next 786 years. And then think again about coming to peace. Juan Manuel Santos put it, I think, very clearly in more than one occasion that I've heard of. It's totally understandable that a man like Uribe, whose father was assassinated by the FARC, and so many others who either suffered in their own persons or through their loved ones, all of this violence, feel the need for some kind of retribution, some kind of punishment. And on the other hand, it's also perfectly understandable for even some of them, and then the rest of us who did not suffer that, to want peace. And so we end up with this, with a concept that I introduced into our reflections, and I will then tell you the origin of the concept, which is pragmatic justice. And the first time that I came across that concept, and it was at the hands of my dear maestro Herb Kelman, came in a spectacularly interesting piece of work published in 1978 in the magazine Foreign Affairs, which is, those of you who are international relations students, I'm sure know, is the journal of the international relations world, published at Columbia University. The author was a Palestinian, a very distinguished Palestinian intellectual named Walid al-Khalidi. His son, no, I'm sorry, his nephew, Rashid al-Khalidi, is a professor of history at Yale who published the most fascinating book on the rise of the national identity of the Palestinians. Walid, the uncle, came at this from the following reality. As I'm sure all of you know, because this is part of our essential basic knowledge in the field of conflict, when the British mandate in Palestine was coming to an end after the UN resolution in 1945, determining basically the end of Western imperialism in the world, the British made a very sincere effort to try to find a solution to these two peoples, each of them with a historical narrative that was mutually exclusive with the other, each of which historical narratives justified the presence, the exclusive presence of one of those two groups on that territory, etc. And they came up with, the Peel 1 and Peel 2 commissions came up with the famous idea of the two-state solution. And the Palestinians were the ones who turned it down. Palestinians said, no, we were here when these people began to come across from Europe after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, and we're the ones who have the right to stay here, they should go back to wherever they came from. The Palestinians turned it down. Then came what happened, the unilateral establishment of the State of Israel, the extraordinary development of that state, that society, the pounding and pummeling of the Arab armies in several wars, and eventually, Walid al-Khalidi in 1978 published an article in Foreign Affairs, the title of which is, I think, very significant. The title was, Thinking the Unthinkable. What had the unthinkable become for the Palestinians? The two-state solution. And Khalidi expressly says, look, it's not fair. I agree it's not fair. Our homes were taken away, but what are we going to do? Are we going to keep on and on and on trying to establish some sort of sense of personal but one-sided justice, or do we want to be pragmatic about it? And that is what these transitional justice systems are all about. That's what the South African system was about. That's what is being attempted here. Is it fair? No. It's pragmatic. Blank.
This is like when you forgive, you know, you're trying to tie this with the justice, the pragmatic justice. When you forgive, you don't forgive because the other person is right. You're not giving the you know, like the reason, like the.
You're not giving, no le estás dando la razón.
Exacto, yo no le estoy dando la razón. You don't forgive for the other.
You're not granting their rightness.
Exactly. You are doing it by yourself, not because it's not because it's for them.
No, it's not that simple, because as Manili pointed out earlier, it often has to do with the other person's recognizing, admitting, asking for forgiveness. But certainly the act itself you're not recognizing as right. And even that, you know, were you here when I described this conversation with Desmond Tutu, when you described the woman who, you know, she said, and I hope he forgives me. So she was in some way granting him legitimacy in having thrown the bomb. So it's not quite as simple as you aren't. You may be, but you may also not be. You may be just, when you say you're forgiving, what you're basically saying is, all right, forget it, yeah. I give. So now I've complicated your remarks. Can you complete them, please?
Yeah, I know. The thing is that in talking about the states, right? There are states. The states. When the states are led by somebody that has the will, put his will on. O sea, lo que quiero decir es que el líder de la nación que pone toda su voluntad y su deseo, como que todo el Estado siente lo mismo. ¿Qué es lo que pasó con Correa? O sea, la gente pudo haber estado ya, pasó, pero él otra vez, y lo mismo con lo que pasó en Ruanda. O sea, tienes un líder que termina moviendo a la nación con su voluntad individual.
I'm sorry, I'll return to you in English. English is the language of the course. I'm just not terribly persuaded, and I respect your view if you are persuaded, that it's that simple in terms of the leader imposes a. I think the 50-50 vote on the Colombian plebiscite is a perfect example of that. Uribe was completely convinced that the agreement, that even sitting down to negotiate with FARC had been a mistake, because it was granting them some kind of human status that he denies them. But another 50% of Colombians were in agreement with, even despite the deep weaknesses in the transitional justice system. Even despite the fact that even I'm willing to admit, much as I am a proponent of transitional justice, much as I am a proponent of Walid al-Khalidi style pragmatic justice, I think that a lot of these FARC leaders were going to get away with, are going to get away with, very likely, with having committed terrible atrocities. But everything put in the balance, and this is ultimately a matter of value judgment, and quite the contrary to what you're saying, I submit that it is very critical that we recognize the importance of each individual's value judgment and getting to the point where it really becomes feasible for a society as a whole to live with the transition. This happened to us between Peru and Ecuador. It was, there were a lot of, I was very much involved in that process. There was an unbelievable amount of skepticism when the negotiations began. Somebody who would really be interested in bringing into your program is Pepe Ayala, Jose Ayala Lasso. Very dear personal friend, por si acaso. So I'll be happy to help you make that point. Jose Ayala Lasso was the foreign minister who, he was named foreign minister by Fabián Alarcón as transitional president, and then remained with Yamil Mawad, and eventually was the signatory of the agreement. And talked to Jose Ayala, and you realize that there was this unbelievable skepticism. It was one of the things that had to be worked against as the agreements were being negotiated, so that when push came to shove, on both sides of the border, there was essentially an acceptance of the agreement. If there isn't that, it doesn't make sense. But I'm not sure if the key is this question of the sort of omnipotent leader. Well, I think it is a pretty key concept. Is it the leader, or is it the possibility of a sufficient number of members of that society is accepting the pragmatism of the justice system that reaches, to use that classic concept, the tipping point, the point where we're willing to say, okay, yeah, let's move forward. I incline more to the second, but I respect your view if you incline more to the first. There's some fascinating leadership issues involved there that we can talk about later. But let's go back, if I may, to the justice issue that you began raising, I think, and I intended to raise. If your sense, your individual sense of justice is not adequately satisfied by that process of moving from enmity, confrontation, to some form of, at the coldest end of the spectrum, cohabitation, not even highly connected cohabitation, but just non-aggressive, non-confrontation cohabitation. Ni se diga, moving really in the direction of how I propose to define reconciliation, which is we move into establishing a working relationship that is mutually enhancing. If your sense of justice is not satisfied in some sort of way, then this becomes impossible. It's psychologically untenable. It's just too contradictory. We're back to the essence of why highly escalated conflict needs to be understood in terms of its essential psychological dimensions. The demonization of other, the dehumanization of other, the individuation of other, that makes us simply unable to conceive of situations where both of us are being satisfied. No, that demon has to be punished. That demon has to be destroyed. It is my moral obligation to destroy that demon. God will, we hear Sunnis and Shiis both issuing this statement, God will premiarme. Come on, help me out.
What was the word?
Premiarme.
Reward.
Reward me, thank you very much. God will reward me for killing this evil exponent of the other side. As long as all of that psychological reality is present, reconciliation just doesn't make any sense. And this is why I submit that both pragmatic justice, these transitional justice systems that are highly pragmatic, and Worthington's contribution that takes us away from insisting on only forgiveness is the road to balance become absolutely critical to creating these preconditions to our being able to think of reconciliation. Anything else is just, priests up on pulpits saying you should reconcile, but that doesn't even begin to be a necessary condition. It's not necessary, not sufficient, not anything. Again, I opened it up a bit. We still have a little bit of time left because I have one last third major set of issues which have to do with third-party intervention in this request for reconciliation. But I'd appreciate it if I help you not fear death. Comments? Issues? How have we responded to the pragmatic justice systems that we have seen? Did South Africa make sense? Does Colombia make sense? Or are we ultimately opposed?
Well, I've heard like South Africa that as the wheel kind of turns on this, that there's still at heart a need for retributive justice for some key players that I think that, like you described.
Well, none of the systems has ever gone completely away from retributive justice for key players, not even the Colombian system, which is extremely benign. But even it contemplates considerable retributive justice for key players. It's the idea of reconciliation as wandering in the wilderness. And he uses the famous biblical passages of wandering in the desert. If any of us has any experience with, has observed, has even read on and thought about mediating a negotiation, this is fairly clean cut. My view of mediation is essentially assisted negotiation. You're there to help parties who are already, they've satisfied Hal Saunders, they're at the negotiating table, they're no longer really concerned with taking each other's eyes out, but are seeking a negotiated settlement to the specific dispute. It's fairly easy to say, okay, I propose, let's not start with proposal. I mean, we can go down Fisher and Urey as mediators, and this is pretty straightforward, and you know where you're going, and it's difficult to get lost as a mediator. Whereas when you're trying to help people reconcile with one another, and there are these latent hatreds, these suspicions, these remnants of what actually caused the conflict to become so escalated that it was even unmanageable at a negotiation of the settlement of the dispute level, then John Paul points out, I think, very, very clearly and successfully that you can frequently not know where you are, what the next step is, where you're to go, and what this requires of us as third parties, and I think this is extremely important. I don't know how many of you are eventually interested in our field. Those of you who are not of our field but are sort of connecting to our field. I don't know how many of you have actually considered eventual third-party work. But if you are in fact considering third-party work, I think this understanding reconciliation as wandering in the wilderness or wandering in the desert connects very much to a concept on which Lederach is extraordinarily eloquent, which is the need for humility. There is so much evidence of third parties barging into conflict situations saying, I'm going to fix this. I have the answers. And the call to humility is, I think, best served by considering some of these extraordinary difficulties that arise when you're trying to reconcile people beyond the settlement of the specific conflict. When there is still that pain, that hatred, that dissatisfaction, that sense of injustice, that sense of they're trying to force pragmatic justice down my throat. No, that's not right. This boils up very profound emotions. And so if we as third parties come along arrogantly saying, but I have the answer. The answer is do this, do that. I think we actually render very valid a famous remark that Donna Hicks came out with just spontaneously at one time we were having dinner with friends in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She said there are frequently there's frequently nothing more dangerous than a well-intentioned amateur interfering in a conflict. We become well-intentioned amateurs if, no matter how trained we are in mediation, in de-escalation, in interactive problem solving, a la Herb Kelman, we begin thinking that we have the answers, and we have a classic article that was published in the 60s called "Have Method Will Travel." If we think that our method will work in this situation because we have the right method. So one reflection on third-party intervention in this particularly difficult portion of our total universe, which is attempting to help people deal with conflict. And the other reconnects with forgiveness. And it's again a John Paul Lederach remark that I think is absolutely beautiful. Not only do we put a great deal of stress on forgiveness, but we add forgive and forget, which is a total impossibility unless you suffer frontal lobotomy. You will always continue to remember. So he posits something that I think is spectacular. He says, no, the issue is not forgive and forget. The issue is remember, but learn. Reframe, reformulate, which connects in some ways, Blanca, I think, to something that you and I were talking about for a moment, and I saw you nodding very substantially to when I was addressing it, which is this possibility of actually cognitively deciding to let it go. That would be one of my, not the only, but certainly one of my interpretations of what John Paul Lederach wants to say by the word learn. You just view it differently, understand it differently, conceive it differently, and therefore chop the baggage. Actually, he would in that very beautiful piece that I also commend to your attention. It says five qualities of practice, which is a poetic concept. Qualities of practice. He poses a couple of others that are very important. Another important thought that comes from there is something that I alluded to much earlier. When we're resolving the conflict, we're first de-escalating to create the conditions, pre-negotiation, house saunders, in order to get people to a Fisher-Uri or mediated situation where we're negotiating. The focus is on the specific aspirations that are incompatible that we're trying to compatibilize. Who should hold the Sinai? Who should have use of the waters in the Rio Lauca, which is the current dispute between Bolivia and Chile, that is finally being taken to the World Court? Where should the border run? But once we've settled those specific disputes, as I suggested earlier, to come back to, we now become centered on something far broader and much less precise and definable, which is reconciliation is relationship-centered. It focuses on the nature of the way in which we relate to one another. Not with regard to that specific, but with regard to everything. Whether we greet one another or not, whether we're hostile to one another or not, whether we help one another or not in case of need, et cetera, et cetera. I will stop there because I would really, really like us to see if we can, at least for the last 15 minutes, interact more. But for the moment, we have an old expression that the military and the police present in their reports to their officers. That's what I have to report. So, esto que tengo que reportar.
Can I raise a question that connects some of the other parts of this program with what you're talking about? So we saw with a very close plebiscite result that there is polarization among the Colombian population, and part of the campaigning was about this idea: what do we need in order to come back together? And justice was central to that conversation. I wrote an article actually right as it was happening, which I had to rewrite because the result didn't come out the way I expected it to. But preparing for that, I was interviewing people, Colombians abroad, in Ecuador and Venezuela and elsewhere, and a lot of them were saying, I long to go back home, right? My heart is in Colombia, but my feet are in Venezuela, as one guy said. And at the same time as that, he said, I can't imagine going home because of this.
There's the erratic creatures in the title of my book.
this broken relationship. And so part of the challenge, I think, for peace builders is how to achieve that when there's geographic distance. Because relationship building, you just posited, is central to reconciliation. And it becomes almost a chicken and an egg thing. People often don't feel secure, feel safe enough to go start that process, move their bodies geographically close enough to engage until there's some level. But that level, how can that get accomplished if they aren't able to engage?
My first response, Jeff, would be that clearly another subject on which I would love to delve further with you. But my first response would be that proximity is almost essential to the actual process of reconciliation. That Colombians living in Venezuela, Colombians living in Ecuador are not really the most obvious subjects for me of a reconciliation process. The Colombians living in Colombia. We're right there with the perpetrators, and as you very intelligently pointed out, there's perpetration and victimization on both sides, so that almost, well, not again, let's get away from almost everybody, but a large number of the parties, of members of both parties, are both perpetrators and victims, and the dynamic has to be, I think, that very close-knit dynamic. If you are a Colombian that escaped the violence, was not even touched by it, but came away even before it touched you, it seems to me that you're just not close enough to this very, very subtle dynamic that the whole process involves.
I don't think I would go along with the positing of the Colombians abroad as having not been touched by violence.
No, I'm saying if you are. Okay. If you're one that escaped before the violence touched you. Okay? Even more extreme. But let's assume it touched you. Interestingly, one of my very, very dear colleagues in Picard at Harvard is a Colombian, young lawyer. Not much, he was a young lawyer when his father was murdered by the FARC, exactly as Uribe's father was. And he took exactly the opposite road. He was a young practicing attorney in Bogotá. His father was assassinated. He left Colombia and went to BU to study conflict resolution with Nadine Romana. And Camilo Azcárate has shared with me his terrible sense of being so far away from the specific dynamics. He's now a World Bank official. Never went back to Colombia. Touched by, but still, there's this removal from the potential even day-to-day frictions that you have to go dealing with, and the constant living the dilemma from moment to moment, from day to day, that I think is, I'm positing for the moment as my working hypothesis. I'm always willing to abandon a position when I become convinced that another is better, but my sense is that it's very difficult to be, or much more difficult to be a significant actor, not being immersed in the reality. I'd love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, so maybe what is coming out of this is there are phases of the sort of reconstruction of the narrative. And it starts with the people who are physically together because as a survival strategy, right? Yes. In order to move forward, we must create a new collective narrative. And that, I mean, that's consistent with South Africa too, right? Desmond Tutu created the new narrative. Instead of a black and white group within South Africa, we are a rainbow nation, that it is the sort of different strains that make up one that make it possible. And part, I mean, if you go through and look, there was an underside of that. Part of the negotiation that happened was a willingness to accept a collective narrative of everybody being a victim. We were collectively the victim of apartheid, even the white people.
Yes.
And so
yes.
I wonder if that might have to happen in Colombia, where the same thing Alejandra said, a recognition of, you know, almost universal victimhood, a culture of violence that gets transformed in order to create something new together. And then that narrative becomes available for people from outside to plug into. So that occurs to me.
My first response goes in that direction. Part of it has to do, I think, also with the cathartic nature of that moment of confrontation, not in the sense of violence or blows, but confrontation of realities, of pains, which is absolutely essential, I think. Again, have you had a chance to read Donna Hicks's Dignity?
Bits. I haven't read it.
Okay. She has a stunning description in that book of a process that she and Tutu co-chaired of dialogue between opposing two men on the opposing sides of the Northern Irish conflict, and Donna's, who is a very deeply perceptive psychologist, describes extraordinarily that very cathartic nature of the confrontation. My sense is that that's almost essentially necessary, not just necessary. Greg?
A question about, on the mediation side, is someone kind of debating potentially going on
mediation at a negotiation table or third-party intervention in reconciliation?
I would say at the table.
At the negotiation table.
But
we're settling the dispute.
Right, but stepping back a couple of stages, where functioning as, and I know you're familiar with the media landscape, functioning as a communicator, functioning as a community organizer, I feel like you're not there. You need to recognize that, but be familiar or reaching out for language that prepares the ground for ultimate mediation. And I'm just wondering if there's particular language.
I have problems with what you're saying, because I think you're putting too many hats on this poor one human being.
Okay.
And what I would suggest we do is rewind a little bit and think more in terms of the logic of de-escalation prior to and the creation, and certainly, again, I may be biased by a lifelong commitment to an essential approach, but I find it very difficult to conceive of all that except in terms of interaction between the parties, with a third party keeping his mouth shut as much as possible, being as much a fly on the wall as possible, and certainly not being a communicator to the world.
Yeah, not as a mediator,
so
but if there's a way that journalism could be done, let's say just limited journalism, which is so often fused with conflict language. If there's other ways of describing conflict, calling on people, evoking concepts of, well, when was their collaboration, or what was it like, or what did it feel like? So when you interview subjects, it's not about the damage that's happening, but about the hopes, or about the...
I'm trying to grasp where you're coming from. You are a journalist.
Right.
So this is the first thing I need to grasp.
Well, you've talked a lot about framing and narratives, and those can be constructed by particular agents and people. They don't spontaneously come out of nowhere. You're making the argument that the parties are the strongest.
Third-party people.
The strongest conveyors, but certainly third-party people can convey narratives and messages that are destructive. They did in Rwanda. They did in other places.
Yeah, but a lot of that was being done by one or the other of the parties. I have great difficulty with the idea that, for example, you as a journalist, or you invite me to become your colleague for a time, and I become more or less competent in the minimalities of what you represent, going into any one of the conflicts we're talking about and saying, okay, I'm going to construct a narrative, or I'm going to remind you of a history that would be really significant. It's the interaction amongst those involved in the parties. It's the interaction among those that hate one another, that don't listen to one another. Let me give you an example of particular and specific experience. Cut me off when I need to be cut off, Jeff, please, but I would narrate it. It's a very specific experience. Sitting at a table with Herb Kelman on one end of the table, me on the other. We had a group of Jewish Israelis and a group of Palestinian Israelis on one and the other side of the table. We start the process, that interactive problem-solving process, by very strict adherence to control, what John Burton used to call controlled communication. It's actually the introduction of active listening. So one side says what they see and feel and perceive and their perspective on the conflict, the other side just listens and says what, you know.
Right.
So we were going through this, and we had gone through the third day. We were at the third day, and there had begun to appear some sort of sense of rapport between a Palestinian physician and a retired IDF colonel. IDF is the Israeli Defense Force. Curiously called the IDF when it's one of the most successful offensive institutions that has ever existed on the face of the earth. And this physician finally sort of broke the ice, and he said, "Colonel, are you married?" "Yes." "Do you have children?" "Yes, 2 daughters." "Ah, 2 daughters. Colonel, what would you feel?" And I apologize for the crudity of what I'm about to share with you. What would you feel if every time your wife and your daughters go through a checkpoint, let's assume that things were in reverse, that you were under our occupation, because it's how the Palestinians conceive it, that they're under Israeli occupation on the West Bank and in Gaza. West Bank, not Gaza. What would you feel if every time your wife and daughters go through a checkpoint, they were fondled? Enough interaction had taken place between these people that the colonel, I cannot describe to you how that man's face changed. It took him probably some 10 to 12 seconds to respond. Human beings typically respond to one another in a conversation within 1 and 2 seconds. This was a forever wait from the standpoint of those of us who were waiting. And finally what he said was, "Now I understand many things. Please forgive us." The "please forgive us" goes way beyond what we even dream might happen at a table like that. The "now I understand many things" is as far as we dare hope we could get. But "please forgive us" is just a spectacular breakthrough. We are firmly convinced from a social psychological standpoint that that can only happen through interaction. Through actually hearing the pain of other and being able to empathize with it.
Yeah, I'm thinking.
So,
yeah.
but you know, I may be being very unfair to where you're coming from, in the
that's
sense
okay.
that my mind is so skewed in that
Yeah.
direction that I can't really conceive of you or me or anyone else coming in and saying, "Look, I'm going to tell you what this was like, and now everything's going to be okay."
Yeah, I'm not just saying journalism as mediation. I'm saying in the way we talk about peace education for children, you know, we say if we prepare the ground, if we prepare children to understand you will have conflict, here's tools to respond to it. So in communicating popularly, us doing the same thing, saying
Methodological communication, introduction into the theory of conflict, introduction into something as simple as the following, Greg. A great many people understand conflict to be synonymous with war.
Right.
And if we could just deconstruct that simple conceptual error, we would offer an enormous contribution. Let's just understand conflict, as we do in the sort of social psychological perspective, as incompatible aspirations that may or may not lead to war. And once we separate conflict from escalation, I think we're doing an enormous service to being preventive. And in that sense, introduction to theory, yes, absolutely yes. But now in a specific conflict, when you begin talking to Brits or Argentinians or Chechens or Russians, that's where I begin to have more difficulty.
Okay.
Fair?
Yeah.
I wonder if one thing that might actually bridge the gap in these two perspectives is a questioning an assumption. Because Jorge, you're assuming that a journalist is an outsider, a third party. When Greg is writing stuff, he's writing stuff about his own community. He's an organizer within that community and using the mass media to reach out to the different parties. And so I'm thinking of examples like Radio Sucumbios in the Amazon that Ecuadorian, Colombian diaspora there have jointly constructed radio shows for their communities. Search for Common Ground does this. So that might be one way to think about it.
Oh, absolutely. Sorry?
Makes him a party.
Exactly.
He is a
part of a party.
Right.
We come back in many ways to what happened in Rwanda.
Exactly.
They were party transmissions that were happening. And no, I'm sorry, Greg, I hadn't taken it from that standpoint. I was thinking of you, a blonde, blue-eyed American in not even Northern Ireland. He could pass for an Irishman in Rwanda or in Colombia. But no, from that perspective, point very well taken. Yeah.
That's a good distinction. I wasn't even thinking it myself. So.
Yeah, but it was key, and thank you, Jeff, for making it. Okay, well, Time is up.
Let's all thank Jorge for a very stimulating and as you're writing the last bits of this book, small momentum so that you can
Thank you
remember
so much.
the